The CIA confirms paranormal abilities among one of its many experiments during the Stargate project. Released under the Freedom of Information Act in the year 2000, a CIA research paper by the title Research into the Paranormal Abilities to Break Through Spatial Barriers was released, conclusively proving that these type of paranormal abilities were in fact possible. In the abstract of this article, it states that they essentially want to use the strictest scientific methods to be able to determine if objects that they call microbodies can in fact pass through solid spatial barriers. They would have various experiments that you can see detailed through the article where they would hermetically seal glass containers and put certain things within them. In this instance, they would put certain types of tablets. One of the methods in which they prove that these Chi Gong Masters were in fact pulling through these tablets through glass containers, through the walls of the glass containers, is they had several cameras set around the glass containers themselves while they were performing these acts of pulling the pills through the glass containers. And they had several cameras at different frequencies and different speeds, some of them going at 400 frames a second, some of them playing at 500, some of them 800, and some of them 1,000 frames a second, so that they can freeze frame and figure out what was going on during that point where the tablet was being transmitted through the wall itself. And what they found was quite interesting, because they had determined that this phenomenon was actually happening at a speed where the human eye can catch. So there wasn't any type of magic or illusion going on as you would understand magic in the traditional sense. But a lot of these Chi Gong Masters, in fact, had some type of a paranormal ability where they were able to loosen up the frequency or to vibrate those pills through that glass container and essentially have it whole on the other side without breaking the glass container or opening the glass container. Now, this is very reminiscent of a 1940s military project called the Philadelphia Experiment, where essentially they try to make military craft, and in this case, a boat, invisible by adding so much voltage to that craft where they would be able to strip the electrons and thereby make it invisible to the eye. Apparently, they had actually achieved that to some extent, because there are eyewitnesses that had seen that experiment happen, and they said that the boat, in fact, went completely invisible for a couple of minutes for some time. And when it had reappeared, then supposedly some of the people that were on that boat, the military personnel, were completely gone, never to be found again. Some of them reappeared inside the wall where their bodies were sticking out. Some of them looked absolutely normal, but they had some type of mental issues after that, and they were never the same. Some of them had died some days or weeks after that. So I don't want to tangent too far off of this subject, but it is very reminiscent of the Philadelphia Experiment in the context where objects were essentially interpenetrating themselves, and in this case, they were actually being stuck and not penetrating through the walls, as the CIA had confirmed these Chi Gong Masters were doing in their experiments. There was another interesting correlation that I made after reading this article, and it was with a documentary that I had watched produced by PBS probably in the late 80s, early 90s. And it was essentially, it was a crew of people who went through Indonesia and different parts of Asia looking for people with paranormal abilities and psychic powers and so on and so forth. And apparently they had found a guy that never disclosed his real name, but he was called Dynamo Jack. That was the name that he gave the documentary makers. And he had went along and he had showed people all of these different psychic abilities. And one of the things that he did show them is how he could push a chopstick through a table. And his description of how he could do that basically is he'd say he would charge this chopstick, and he would essentially suggesting that he would lose the vibration of both the table and the chopstick so that it would kind of mush through the table, and he could push a whole chopstick through a table without damaging the table itself. And the chopstick, of course, would be whole as if it hadn't happened. So the conclusion of this article makes a pretty bold statement, especially from the fact that it's coming from the CIA. It states, quote, "From the analysis of the videotapes and high-speed photographs of 25 successful experiments in breaking through spatial barriers by a young subject with paranormal abilities, we have proven the existence of one type of paranormal ability, the ability to pass through spatial barriers, that the pass-through point can be the wall of a container, and furthermore, that the passing through the walls occurs over a period of time." So it just goes to show that there's a kernel of truth in every single myth out there. I myself am a big believer of psychic abilities. I think we as people have far more potential than most of us are even aware of on a day-to-day basis. Now, of course, with that being said, there are a lot of charlatans out there that manipulate and dupe people into hoaxes, making them believe that they have powers and abilities that they oftentimes don't. That definitely exists, probably more times than not. But this article essentially does show and prove that these types of abilities are real. Now, on a final note, as kind of a brain teaser, something to consider after watching this video, is with these things seemingly being possible, what are the limitations of human existence and the power of the mind if these things have been proven to be true? For those of you who are familiar with the scripture of the Kundalini Upanishad, you have probably read the section in that Upanishad that talks about siddhas, which are essentially psychic powers, which is another name for paranormal abilities. And you're probably familiar with the fact that there are 32 minor siddhas, or paranormal abilities, and 8 major paranormal or psychic abilities. Now, again, it goes back to that notion and that idea of every myth has some degree or layer of truth. I wonder, if you go back and read all of those psychic powers and those psychic abilities, how many of those were quite possibly true once upon a time, and how many of them could possibly be true and actualized today.